Okay, well, I guess we can start. As typically at King's, we start a few minutes late almost everything, but I think it's time to do this. Now, I really have the pleasure to introduce three guests here coming from the Atlantic Council, and it's going to be a very, very interesting report and very timely report to discuss U.S. LNG exports, both globally and also in terms of their implications to Europe. But let me not take too much time, just have a very brief introduction. We'll start with Bud Coote. He's a senior fellow at Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. He recently retired from the CIA as the agency's leading international energy analyst, and is also key advisor to senior U.S. officials on a wide array of global energy issues. At the CIA, he actually helped to establish and build the CIA's energy program dating back to the 70s. Then we'll have Richard Morningstar, who is the founding director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And he served as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Azerbaijan from July 2012 to August 2014. And he also served as the U.S. ambassador to the European Union between 1999 and 2001. And previously, he was also the Secretary of State Special Envoy for Eurasian Energy, among many other very influential positions that he has in the 90s and earlier. And after that, we also get comments from David Korani, who is the Director for Eurasian Energy Futures Initiatives, and he served as the Undersecretary of State and Chief Foreign Policy and National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of the Republic of Hungary, Prime Minister Gordon in 2009-2010. And with that, I'd like to give the floor to Bud.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a delight to be here today to talk about LNG and roll out our LNG report from the Atlantic Council with you. LNG has been growing very strongly over the past 10 years. There's some irony in that the forecast deficit of gas in the United States was part of the motivation for a lot of the early investment in LNG export facilities. And now it's the shale gas revolution and the prospects of abundant gas in the United States that is propelling a lot of the investment. LNG has grown as a share of gas that is traded internationally to 333 billion cubic meters in 2014, accounting for 1/3 of all traded gas. And LNG is also consumed on a non-traded basis, mostly in the transport sectors of gas producers, where it's used to fuel large trucks and increasingly large ships. And this helps it account for about 1/10 now of all natural gas consumed globally. But we are looking at an increase in LNG export capacity of about another 200 billion cubic meters over the next 5 years through 2020. About 90% of that is going to come from two countries, Australia and the United States. We're already seeing a surge in Australia's LNG exports, and that's going to peak over the next 2 years. Most of their 90 BCM or so capacity will be completed by then. The U.S. is going to start this year, but at a slower pace for the next 2 years, with a stronger surge beginning in 2018 through the following 3 years and probably beyond. The U.S. has about 90 billion cubic meters that is now fully approved and under construction, and it's highly likely to be installed completely by 2020. So that raises the key question of, is all this LNG export going to find markets. We're seeing a low part of the energy cycle for LNG and other fuels right now, a slowing in gas demand growth globally, and low prices that are going to challenge the economics of these projects. Most of these projects were conceived and approved at a much higher price level, but they are being propelled by customer demand, in particular customers who want U.S. LNG because it is reliable, we have inexpensive production, and we have inexpensive capital costs because we are largely converting LNG terminals that were designed and built to import LNG into terminals that can export LNG. So there are a lot of common facilities. You just have to replace the regasification facilities with liquefaction facilities. So it is going to be cheaper than some of the major projects around the world, and I think it's going to be competitive. Besides the slow demand growth and the low prices, there's the return to nuclear power in Japan, which was taken offline following the disaster at Fukushima. And that's going to eliminate quite a bit of demand for LNG. And we also are going to continue to have competition from coal and from renewables, as well as competition from existing pipeline gas, in particular the Russian gas supply, which by some estimates has as much as 100 BCM of surplus capacity now. But there are a lot of positive trends as well. We expect that gas and LNG in particular will get us a strong bump in demand from the Paris Climate Conference and efforts to implement the commitments made there. This is somewhat of a wild card because it's going to depend on governments following through with policies that embrace gas as a clean, the cleanest fossil fuel, one that can help reduce carbon emissions. We also see a kind of a lack of competition worldwide in gas production after the surge in Australian gas and LNG. There's really not a lot that's going to compete with U.S. gas in the 2018-2019 period. By 2020, we expect to see the Southern Corridor established to bring gas from Azerbaijan to Southern Europe. And 2020, I think, is about the soonest we may see other large projects around the world, such as East African gas and Eastern Mediterranean gas, join the market. And by then, the market conditions may be quite a bit different. We think the best news for U.S. LNG exporters, however, is the good match between the objectives of these exporters of marketing their gas and the objectives of the European Union to further diversify their gas sources, to promote competition in the European Union, and to add to their energy security, reducing dependence on a single supplier, which is Russia, of course. I think we've already seen that even a small amount of LNG can make a strong difference in countries' ability to negotiate gas supplies from other suppliers. I think We see it in the case of Poland and Lithuania already. That just less than 3 years ago were paying 40 to 50% more than Germany for Russian gas. And now they have LNG terminals that are barely needed, barely used. But the mere fact that they have access to this alternative source has enabled them to renegotiate their contracts with Germany at a much more favorable price. And we think this is a model that should extend to other isolated areas of Europe. And Europe's focus on expanding infrastructure to connect isolated parts of Europe with the main gas pipelines is going to help LNG exporters from the U.S. by expanding their market and enable them to provide more security to these isolated markets. We also think, though, that there is going to be a growing market in Asia, which has long been leading the growth in demand. In particular, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about China, and some of the developments there could break in favor of the U.S. exporters. One is the exploitation of shale gas, which is going slowly in China. And in fact, around the world, shale gas has failed to gain the traction that it has in North America. And that is because of conditions that are unique to North America, such as ownership of mineral rights by landowners. And we think, especially in the current price environment, that lack of traction of the shale gas revolution outside of North America is likely to continue, and that eliminates quite a bit of competition, at least over the next several years. Also, we see difficulties between Russia and China that are leading to delays in fulfilling the expectations of gas exported by pipeline from Russia to China. China has a growing amount of gas that it's importing from Turkmenistan, and it seems reluctant to make a long-term commitment with Russia that might undermine the independence that LNG provides, and you can buy from other customers or other suppliers. Other Asian customers have been interested in U.S. supplies because they have different kinds of contracts than the oil price index contracts that have been established previously. They are also more flexible, and in particular, they provide leverage in negotiating more favorable terms from other suppliers. The question as we look ahead is how much we think U.S. exports are going to grow. If you add up all of the possible projects that have been proposed in North America, you approach 400 billion cubic meters. I think the best indication is the studies that have been commissioned by the Department of Energy. First one that determined that up to a level of about 120 BCM, the overall economic benefits to the United States are positive. And this is important because the Department of Energy, in order to approve projects, has to certify based on information provided by the exporters, that these LNG exports will not be detrimental to the U.S. economy if they are going to customers that don't have free trade agreements. And that is practically all major customers now except South Korea. So it's important. Late last year, they commissioned a second study looking at the economic impact of expanding LNG exports up to a level of about 200 billion cubic meters. And this also found that the development would be positive for the overall economy of the United States. The Department of Energy said this will inform its future decisions, which means it's likely to continue to approve projects up to at least that 200 BCM level. So I'll stop there.
Well,
Turn it over to our next speaker.
thank you very much. That was very, very informative. And well, let's have Richard Warren start with his comments on this.
Thank you. I'll make briefer comments. Bud really covered the issues, and I think this is a great report, and I can say that because I didn't write it, so I can brag for Bud. But I think this you'll find to be a really helpful report. I would emphasize a few points. There's been a lot of talk about, well, what are the economics of LNG at this point? You know, the price of gas being so low, how can LNG be competitive? There are a couple of, two or three answers to that. First is that most important, and I think Bud pointed this out, is that even if a molecule of LNG never gets to Europe, just its accessibility will be very important and will play a major role in keeping the price of gas down at the low prices that it is today. Secondly, today the price of gas is low. We don't really know what it's going to be 2, 4, 6, 8 years from now. And third, as Bud did point out, we really are in the United States low-cost producers of gas. And even at $7 per MBTU, if you take the Henry Hub price in the United States and add $5 or $6 for transit, it is somewhat competitive. Some in Europe may pay a slightly higher premium to have the diversity. And also, since there's already a large amount of fixed investment, as long as the prices are more than covering variable costs, at least in the short term, it makes sense for American exporters to sell it. They can't do it forever based on covering fixed overhead, because ultimately you go bankrupt if you do that. But you can it's certainly to benefit companies to be selling rather than not selling in the short term. I attended I had a meeting at Goldman Sachs in the fall, and their economists said, "Yeah, there'll never be any LNG sold," and they just went looking at all the various sides of the issue, including the political side. Hey, John. I don't know John Roberts, probably the most well-known energy reporter of all time.
I'm great to get engines on the buses.
So, you know, I think those points are important. It's still critically important, I think, LNG for the EU. Another issue that I've been harping on that actually relates to the LNG situation is the whole question of Nord Stream 2 and the advisability of Nord Stream 2. We were in Brussels for a couple of days prior to coming to London, and I think we were all struck by the fact that it's very hard to find anybody who liked Nord Stream 2. There were a few. We did have some Gazprom representatives in some of the meetings. There are a few in Juncker's cabinet and a few other places, but generally it's very negative. And And I have to say, I took a somewhat rabid approach towards it. Was reported in very blunt terms, and you're active if you want to see what I said in Brussels. It was maybe a little bit exaggerated, but not much. But the bottom line, where I'm coming out on Nord Stream 2, and I say this with the full understanding that Europe is going to continue to buy a lot of Russian gas. That there's no question about it. But that Nord Stream 2 is a bad idea, and for a number of reasons. I don't think it does make sense in light of Europe's new energy strategy, in light of its LNG strategy, to become even more dependent on Russian gas. From a commercial standpoint, I think it only makes sense from one standpoint, and that's to avoid Ukraine. And the question I think one has to ask, is that the right political signal to be sending at this point, given what's happened in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, other activities? It's almost a situation like, should, and I'll put it relatively bluntly, should Russia be rewarded at this point in time, given some of the things that have happened over the last few years? I do think that Nord Stream 2 is contradictory to the new LNG strategy that the Commission announced just last week. And it is only going to create, could only create further division within the EU, particularly with many of the Central and Eastern European countries, and other countries too, who are strongly opposed to it. There are three aspects to Nord Stream 2. There are the commercial aspects, which touched briefly on. Nord Stream 1 isn't full at this point. And then, again, I think the argument from the company standpoint, which I can sort of understand, is, well, is it better to avoid Ukraine looking into the future? But again, I think you can't separate the commercial from the political as much as some would like to do. You've never been able to separate on many of these issues, the commercial from the political. And that has to be taken into account. Interesting legal arguments, pro and con, with respect to Nord Stream 2, and how that'll come out, we'll see. I do think the arguments are squishy enough that if the Commission wants to take the political view that Nord Stream 2 is not compatible with the EU's energy market at this point in time, that it has a legal justification if it goes in that direction. So I mean, this is sort of a tamer discussion than what I said in Brussels. But you get the idea that I feel pretty strongly about it. And we'll see how it turns. We'll see how it turns out. I mean, Europe has enough issues dividing itself now, and this may not be as big an issue as the migration issue or Brexit. Maybe it's I don't know whether maybe talking about the European Union here in London today is questionable, but I think it is a major issue, and it has to be taken.
Well, thanks, Ambassador Morningstar. This was a very frank overview of LNG and also some of the potential competition with LNG, especially with Nord Stream 2. Now, David Korani.
Thank you, President. I would actually go Brexit, another bad idea in addition to Nord Stream. I just wanted to.
We all agree on that.
Just wanted to briefly touch upon two issues, one on the US side and one on the European side. Bud already alluded to the fact that when it comes to liquefied natural gas or indeed gas exports from the United States, in a somewhat ironic way, this is still a fundamentally restrictive regulatory environment, which is ironic from the point of view that we are talking about the United States, which is the champion of free trade all over the world. But because of historical reasons going back to the 1930s, natural gas export is still restricted. There were multiple attempts to ease the restrictions and even to completely do away with the restrictions and liberalize natural gas exports. We indeed had a bipartisan Atlantic Council task force that advocated just that. We have seen some progress on the oil side in December, somewhat unexpectedly in people's minds. As part of the December budget deal, crude oil exports are now completely liberalized and allowed. And there is a bipartisan bill on the Hill that is a wider bill on the energy sector modernization in the US that also contains some provisions on the easing of the restrictions and introducing some transparency and additional certainty in terms of timeline into the process. But that will still not do away with the fundamentally restrictive nature of the whole licensing process when it comes to LNG exports. So in my mind, there is a major risk involved in US LNG exports going forward from the political side. And if you put it into the context of an increasingly isolationist foreign policy view in Washington in the election debates context today, unfortunately on both sides of the aisle, then I'm somewhat worried down the line that despite the fact that we have significant quantities already licensed and approved, when it comes to additional quantities into the future, there is a political risk involved. So I think from that perspective, the conclusion is that when it comes to the TTIP negotiations in the context of TTIP, it's critically important to involve an explicit provision in TTIP that would stipulate that LNG exports to Europe would be liberalized or should be liberalized. TTIP in and of itself will be a free trade agreement, so it would put the European Union member states into that category of FTA countries. But what happens if there is a change in domestic legislation in the US, again, going back to the domestic political issues? So it's much better to have an international guarantee, much better to have a safeguard locked in TTIP. The second issue I briefly wanted to touch upon is on the European side. So last week, the European Commission came out with its winter package, which is a package of multiple legislation and communication by the Commission. There is this communication on LNG and storage strategy. And essentially, in my mind, the Commission takes a very, very pragmatic approach to European energy strategy. They essentially recognize the fact that when it comes to the European Union as a whole, there is an overcapacity of LNG import terminals, about 200 BCM all across the EU. The problem is that they are unevenly distributed. So if you look at the map of Europe, then Western Europe is amply supplied, and you have bottlenecks in as much as the ability of LNG supplies reaching Europe's shores to make it to areas that are not connected very much. So the task is not really to build up additional regasification capacities, although that has some merits in certain places. But the task is to complete the internal market and to do away with these bottlenecks in three regional places in particular. One is the Iberian Peninsula, to build a mid-cat pipeline, which will essentially connect the pipeline or the LNG capacity in Spain that is vastly underutilized with France and the rest of the European Union. The second is the Baltic, which now Lithuania has a terminal, but it's not connected well enough to the rest of the Baltics. And the third is Southeast Europe and the Croatian terminal, or if the Croatian terminal doesn't fly, then a connection to the underutilized Italian terminals and connecting the rest of the Balkans, also with the Greek existing terminal.
Let me just add one thing to what David was saying, because I agree that there's political risk in the United States on LNG. We talk about all the problems that the EU is having. When you look at the United States and you see how Congress is working, and you look at the Republican primaries, and we're not exactly free of our own issues. But one of the things that David mentioned, our bipartisan task force report that we did last year, and you can find it on our website. It's actually quite significant, because what we did do was we related the U.S. energy boom to national security. And we made the argument that the lifting of the oil export ban, which was lifted late this year as part of a budget compromise, and some luck involved, and easing the restrictions on LNG was a major part of that report. And I think, I wish I could say that our report brought about the lifting of the export ban. I can't go that far, but it did contribute because I think what did allow many in Congress and in the Senate, particularly on the Democratic side, to go along was the national security implications. And for example, the effect on Europe, just as one example. And I do think that the EU and European member states, particularly the Central and Eastern European countries, and Congress loves the Central and Eastern European countries, that their strong advocacy on these issues helped a lot. So I definitely agree with David. There's significant political risk, but I'm somewhat optimistic that because of the national security implications that things will hold.
All right, thank you. So I guess we can open this to questions. And let me ask you first that you introduce yourself, and I'll try to get at least 3 questions at once from 3 people. So we can, and if you also can indicate whether you're actually directing the question towards a particular person. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, question to.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, Eddie Kaiser from the Coal Foreign Policy Foundation. But you said that Japan is going back to nuclear and that might impact gas imports. But my understanding is that from recent media reports that Japan is going back to coal. They're planning 45 new coal power plants. And I also noticed that in many other Asian countries, there are huge plans for new coal power plants. And I'm wondering, given the low gas price and given the kind of global availability of gas, basically, why countries like Japan and India, obviously, and even China, and many other Asian countries are still betting on coal, whether it's because of economic or security reasons. There are, I think, around 2,000 coal power plants being planned globally. So this competition, in a way, between gas and coal seems still to exist. And what's your take on these countries going to coal rather than gas?
Okay, well, my take is that coal is still low cost. Gas has become much more competitive. But the biggest problem is that these projects were planned when gas prices were about 3 times higher, 3 times what they are now. So there is reason for hope that the combination of the commitments made at the Paris Climate Conference, together with this growing competitiveness of gas, is going to affect those plans, if not immediately, in the future. We are also seeing countries such as China and India that are experiencing strong pollution problems in their cities, shifting more toward gas as a cleaner fuel. But you are right, coal is a threat to further expansion of gas demand, even though current projections are that gas demand is going to grow at least twice as fast as oil demand. But coal is still there, especially outside the United States. In the United States, we are rather unique in lowering our carbon emissions, mostly because we have been substituting gas for coal in electric power generation.
I mean, just that, you pointed out that there's also a security of supply issue involved, particularly in China. The Chinese are very, very concerned about higher import dependency rates when it comes to external energy supplies from anything. So it's not just gas, but other resources as well. So they formally try to keep import dependency below 40% or so. It's not an official policy, but that's informally business policy. So very, very cautious in increasing that ratio higher because they are afraid of oil dependency.
Yes.
Go ahead, please. Michael Crowd used to work for the Petroleum Economist and Walter J. Levy. Just wanted to know, Mr. Coote, you was mentioning again, asking a former question about India in the prospects of increasing LNG supplies there due to the problems of coal within India, high ash contents, and the problems of states like Gujarat, where I guess there are a couple of LNG terminals. What are the chances of that increasing amounts in the future, together again with the problems of air pollution?
Well, another excellent question. I hope prospects are good because India has tremendous potential for growth in gas. It isn't one of the primary targets of the U.S. LNG exporters because of its location. It's more convenient for the Persian Gulf. Most of its gas now comes from Qatar, and Australia will provide additional supplies in the future. The conditions are there to propel gas demand, including the pollution problems. And if there is a willingness of the government to turn away from coal, as we and others think it will, and it will be a tremendous source of growing demand.
Does the American and Indian government have free trade relationships, or what is the situation?
You know, the other point about India that's interesting, there's a lot of talk about, well, what's Iran going to do with its gas? And, you know, people talk about whether Iranian gas is owned by Europe, which is highly possible but highly questionable at this point. But India is a natural customer for Iranian LNG. Is that right? So,
I guess one could probably also add that in India, the domestic supply has been having trouble in the past few years. It actually has been declining despite all of its aspirations for significant growth. John, I guess you got it.
Yeah. It's another one, but I don't know if anybody has ever done it. Are you aware of any statistics or figures for how much carbon, in effect, the US has exported? Because it's cut its carbon by substituting gas for coal in the United States, but at the expense of increased coal exports to Europe, notably contributing, of course, to the paradox of Germany, which has put all that money into renewables and now produces more carbon than anybody else, or than it has done for a long time anyway. Do you know how much carbon in that sense the US is exporting? Because I think if you added it up, the question might be, is the US in fact still contributing to an increase in carbon rather than a decrease?
But maybe you know statistics, but I think there's you should jump in, but I think there's a secondary question for that. Yeah, the United States has exported a lot of coal, and we hear that a lot. But then the question is that incrementally increasing the amount of coal that's used, or is it substitution for other coal? And I think you'd have to look at, because it may be a cheaper price, it could be substituting for other coal. And so you have to look at whether it's contributing to the an overall increase in the use of coal, which I don't have the statistics on that, but I don't know if that's the.
No, I don't have the data.
It was really wondering, questioning whether anybody has such data.
Right.
I wasn't specifically.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
It's also admittedly a political issue in
Yeah.
the United States.
Right. Yes.
James Waddell from Argus Media. I was wondering, maybe you mentioned this a bit earlier, but in terms of the competition within Europe, you've got, it's not just Russia we're talking about, Norway, we're talking about Nigeria, we're talking about Qatar, and Algeria. And in the past, you've seen a lot of gas being diverted to Asia because of the high prices. Now the prices are more or less level. That's less possible. So a lot of the long-term contracts are now being sent back to Europe, to France, to Spain. Doesn't that really close off the opportunity for additional US exports to Europe?
Perhaps is there any other question on the competition with LNG? Yes, Slaughter.
Yes, some measures here with users. Just like, if you could elaborate a bit on these three main export sectors. We have the Gulf, which is at the moment the biggest exporter of LNG, but we also have Australia, which is coming up and is going to overtake Qatar as the biggest exporter of LNG, and US is stepping in. So how do you see, I mean, purely speculation, way forward, how these three main energy export centers are going to evolve? What is your take on that?
Well,
You want
Related to this, the
Yeah,
competition. Okay,
earlier
great.
related to do you see any growth in Russian LNG exports? Like they've got Sakhalin online at the moment, but Yamal is perhaps coming online for 2020. Is there any other projects you could see being realised?
well, let's address that one first. And more discreet. There are plans to expand Sakhalin 2 exports as well as Yamal. I would put both of those in the category of the gas that we may see as of 2020, the Southern Corridor, East African gas, and Eastern Med gas. So, because of the excess capacity that Gazprom has in its pipeline network. In the current market conditions, Yamal is likely to come on slowly, but eventually, because it is owned by entities that are not Gazprom in particular. I'm going to the wider question of how these three export centers are going to work. That's very intriguing, and there are a lot of possibilities. If we look around the world, there are most of the large regions are gas deficit. That includes Europe. Europe will have growing import demand, even if gas demand stagnates or grows slowly. The limits now on the Netherlands' largest field are going to reduce production quite measurably and create demand for imports. Asia, according to the IEA, is going to have a deficit of another 400 billion cubic meters in about 15, 20 years. Latin America, or South America, is gas deficit. Africa is gas deficit. And the Middle East is gas deficit. So there's a lot of potential markets, at least for smaller amounts of LNG imported gas. As I said before, Australia will naturally focus on Asia, where it can find customers. Australian gas is much more expensive than US gas to produce and to liquefy, because they have all these large deepwater projects. But their advantage is shipping proximity to markets in Asia, including India. So they will focus there. Russia is trying to focus on Asia. This well-known pivot to the east started a couple of years ago. But that's running into roadblocks, especially as they try to negotiate a stronger commitment from China with their gas line imports. I think, as we said before, U.S. LNG will be competitive in Asia. We see a more likely split between Europe and Asia for the majority of the exports. Also, as I said, U.S. exports are going to start slowly under the 90 BCM capacity we expect by 2020. There will only be about 20 BCM online by the end of next year. And if we split that between Europe and Asia, that's only 10 BCM for Europe, which is the equivalent of the first phase of the Southern Corridor, which Russia called enough gas for a barbecue, Gazprom specific. So we see room for at least that 10 BCM. And then once we get beyond 2017, we could see considerably different market conditions overall. We could see a resurgence in gas demand growth for a number of reasons that I mentioned before. The climate considerations and growth in demand that is spurred in part by the low prices we're seeing now.
Yeah, just very briefly on the first question, all the LNG could be there, be available in today's maybe oversupplied market. Today is today. It's not, as I said before, today is today. It's not 2 years from now. It's not 4 years from now. It's not 6 years from now. Or 8 or 10 years from now. And just to repeat that just the availability of LNG, even if none in the short term goes to Europe, maybe it all goes to Asia in the short term. I don't know, but it's still available, and will have an effect on the market. So, just an anecdote. Back in the 90s, I was working on the pipeline from Bud Coote to Jehan, Bud Coote to Boozy Jehan pipeline. The companies were complaining about the economics of the pipeline. Obviously, they had some money ahead, and it's been a very good project. But I remember going to BP in 1998, and they gave this presentation about the future of oil and why this was such a questionable project. Today we're talking about the horrors of $30 to $35 oil. At that time, the price of oil was $8 a barrel, and their economic forecasts were that it would never, ever, ever, ever go above $18 a barrel. And so, the question being, how could they do the project, which they ultimately did. They didn't want to leave all that oil stranded in Caspian. But so the point being, you just hard to predict. It's good to have it ready.
Just on the Russian side, I think Anna is in a better position to answer that question, but also the sanctions and the access to financing is going to be a serious limitation on some of these Russian energy projects to go forward anytime soon. So I expect significant delays. There's also Vladivostok, the expansion of Sakhalin, and these are all sanctioned entities and entities that are having difficulties in terms of access to financing.
Yes, well, on the impact of sanctions on Russian LNG, it is partly related to financing, but there is always this question mark about where the future lies in terms of the future of the sanctions, because if the sanctions were in any way extended to LNG technology, then, according to one estimate, especially with respect to liquefaction technology, Well, it's more than 90% actually, that technology comes from the US. Currently, that's not under sanctions, but again, this is a question mark, which is in the minds of investors as well, which could have an impact in the form of delays. Just to follow up on the competition, how would you see Nord Stream 2 particularly? Is it, I mean, would you consider that as something that is likely to bring competition because it brings new gas, or it's actually because of other factors, because it's more in the form of implications on European having a common European energy policy or creating differences among members? Where do you see particularly the impact of Nord Stream 2 if it's realized?
I think you're our expert on Nord Stream 2.
No, I'm only the expert on disliking this. and again, a lot of that, a lot of that is the politics. That to the extent, I guess a couple of things, you really should jump in, but whether it's a good question whether or not this is additional gas or totally substitutes for Ukrainian gas. It certainly has the ability for there to be additional gas, and that particularly with additional gas coming into Northern Europe, one of the obvious potential landing places for American LNG are in the new terminals in Lithuania and Poland, and so it could have an effect on that. Obviously, as you pointed out earlier, it's also going to be important to build up the interconnections in Western Europe to get LNG east, particularly connecting Spain and France, which has always been an issue. So I do think that it does create additional dependence on Russia. It can have an effect on LNG, and it also has serious political implications right now. I think
Yeah, well, my thoughts are there are limited options for governments to improve energy security, especially in the United States, where we have a cultural bent toward relying on the private sector as the best source of providing energy for the country. But what governments can do is promote diversity, both in supply sources and routes. LNG does provide additional diversity. Nord Stream 2 doesn't. You can integrate your markets, which the EC is trying to do. You can create storage and linkages to that storage that makes that a great source of security. And you can promote liberalization of your energy systems, which also creates more liquidity and flow from one area to the other as demand shifts and as supply is needed. And all of those are the stated goals of the EU. But Nord Stream 2 would tend to undermine those goals and efforts.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. And as you were talking, and as I was sort of formulating further responses to the question, maybe the issue isn't even whether it is the same gas or whether it's new gas. And there will still be a lot of gas purchased from the Russians. But creating the diversity and maybe not buying as much gas from the Russians, which would be less likely if they were Nord Stream 2. But maybe that's also, a very important consideration to create the diversification and create a more competitive, more transparent marketplace.
Thanks. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm Tony Allen from King's College here, but my interest is water. The price of water. We don't have a price for water in 92% that goes into the food supply chain. But we're talking about energy here. Cheap energy, even George Bush pointed out that people are addicted to cheap energy. Certainly they're addicted to cheap food, absolutely wall to wall. Poor people need cheap food, governments need to feed poor people, so cheap food is food stamps in the United States. So there are ways of dealing with this. My question is about the environment, because you mentioned it once or twice in the background, you're aware of it, that it can steer things, especially COP21 and so on, just get the attention. The reason that we can have cheap energy and certainly cheap food is because we don't capture the environmental costs to some extent, which is part of it. There have been attempts on the carbon side to have carbon markets. On the food side, there are just nowhere at all. There's no chance of getting water priced in there. That's sort of the big mountain there. But what is the situation in carbon? Is it significant in the United States that there be a carbon market? Is there any appetite for that? Is it significant? Is it just small noise in a very noisy world? Can we perhaps, you're in the middle in this, in that you've got lots of dirty energy, so you're in the middle. Can you just give us a feel for what you think about the environment?
David's will have some nothing to do.
Exactly what I'm going to do. I agree with what David is going to tell you, because he's been working on this issue.
And I guess David, you can mention when the report is coming on this issue.
So I just finished that paper that is part of our strategy paper series, in the context of which we look into long-term strategic challenges that the United States face, both in terms of certain geographic areas, the Southeast Asia strategy, Africa strategy, Europe strategy, and also thematic areas. And one of the areas is energy. And these are long-term, very ambitious, very aspirational papers. I wouldn't say that everything that is in it will be realized tomorrow, even, of course, the actual context and all the noise that comes with it. But in this paper, I advocate for the introduction of a federal carbon tax.
But don't bet all your money that it's going to happen quickly.
Yes, so again, long-term aspirational. I had a lot of conversations on the Hill, including on the Republican side, and many in Washington. And my feeling is that, of course, not now, not before the elections. Of course, when you look at the Republican side of the aisle, the noise and the anti-climate change rhetoric, it's hard to fathom today that this is going to happen anytime soon. But if you look at, if you talk to people behind the scenes, if you talk to people in Republican offices on the Hill, when it comes to policy tools, first of all, there is an increasing recognition that climate change is real, and it's a real concern for the electorate. It's not very high in terms of the priority list, so it's not one of the top concerns. But it's, when it comes to, there is no major difference between how Republican and Democratic voters view climate change as a threat. Both actually view climate change as a threat that is not as high on their priority list as of now. But again, there is no major discrepancy in terms of how they view it as a threat. And then again, when it comes to policy tools against climate change, carbon tax is probably the most popular among Republicans, including the business establishment and business constituency close to the Republican Party. So there is a lot of thinking going on in the background. There's a lot of discussions behind the scenes. Again, this is not going to come out in the next couple of months. Of course, the election will deposit everything. But I think there is something going on which could eventually lead to a more sensible and more ambitious U.S. climate policy. Again, this is my ambitious and aspirational.
You know, one other point that was interesting, although I don't think it's the policy of any energy company, big energy companies at this point to support publicly the carbon tax, but a surprising number of top executives at some of these companies say, yeah, you know, we really ought to have the carbon tax.
Actually, excellent model came out.
I guess they did say it publicly, yeah.
Science, I understand. The reality is that any Republican who's come out for a carbon tax was deselected. There's absolutely no appetite to make energy more expensive now that America has cheap energy. So I don't think that is really a realistic scenario. Even a lot of Democrats wouldn't take a unilateral carbon tax. I don't think that is a realistic scenario. And in any case, when you talk about the competitiveness of LNG, I think there's a realistic scenario that other countries at a certain price level, obviously now prices are very low and will remain low for some time, but eventually most analysts assume that other countries will start using fracking technology and go for their own shale deposits. Europe, Britain, France have huge shale deposits, and it's just a question of price when these countries will start going for their own natural gas. So that is the other question I had for you. As long as American gas remains low and the LNG price remains low, there's obviously a good chance to sell it around the world. But other countries, Argentina and South America, China, and Britain are all gearing up for shale exploration. And as I said, the price, one of the reasons why shale gas is so cheap is that the cost of actually getting it out of the ground has come down so significantly, which is why the whole OPEC strategy of trying to undermine the shale revolution hasn't worked, because for some technological reasons, it's becoming ever more cheap to actually getting both oil and gas out of the ground. And I guess this is a technological process that will continue, so that the extraction prices are lowering, and therefore the gas remains low. But at some point, there will be competition for American shale gas in other parts of the world. And that's a price question, I guess.
I would respond to that. Maybe. We were very excited in the United States about promoting shale in other parts of the world, going back to the beginning of the Obama administration. When I was working for Hillary Clinton as a special envoy, we had a global shale initiative that we were trying to help other countries do it. And there may be some where it ends up being policy. Europe has been a gigantic disappointment. And I don't think, at least in the foreseeable future, shale is going to play a major role in Europe. And two of the reasons have already been mentioned. There was one of the reasons, which was the whole question of legal rights with respect to some sort of legal rights in Europe, which are different than in the United States. And but also much more of an environmental issue in Europe. And also, maybe it's going to be different in Britain and France, but Poland, from a geological standpoint, was major disappointment. So there are a lot of differences. And hey, I hope you're right. That shale does develop.
It's there. It's a question if there's enough that can be economically extracted. And as I said, there's a pure price question. If the price remains low,
it's more than price. It's geological. It's what the environmental reactions are going to be, what the regulations end up being.
I guess that there was some discussion a few years ago. What are the main obstacles for shale gas? For most countries, actually, the obstacles are not below the ground. They do have the resources, but the obstacles are above the ground. What do you do in terms of providing the right conditions, the right regulations, and so on? And you had this delay with shale gas, despite this period of quite long period for high prices, and currently they are down, which actually creates a new kind of a new point to consider. Did you have to? Yeah, you wanted to respond
on the carbon tax. Again, I agree, in the current political atmosphere before the elections, of course, nothing will happen. It's quite toxic, it's super sensitive. But I think there is a room for a compromise. There are all kinds of ideas floating in Washington about introducing a carbon tax on one hand, on the other hand, reducing the corporate tax rate, which has a long-standing Republican demand. So to do it in a revenue neutral, opposed to revenue neutral way, which could be one of the solutions. Also, allocate some of the funds you raise through a carbon tax to compensate the losers of the transition, to compensate the coal miners who are losing their jobs anyway, even without the introduction of the carbon tax. So I think there are ways to create some political space for compromise. And there's also, I think, an important point which is very often overlooked is that all politics is local news, particularly here in the United States, and how constituencies change. I mean, Texas is becoming one of the largest renewable developer states, so wind power in Texas, but also increasingly solar is a huge political constituency. Wind power in Oklahoma, so in terms of, again, this is going to be slow, and of course, they don't have the purview yet to compete against the much more entrenched and much more powerful lobbies, but this is changing as well. And this will have an impact on how politics is built up from the bottom up.
Let me also agree with your comments on the carbon tax. Also agree with your comment that eventually we're going to see shale gas development outside of North America. But I do want to protest strongly that it's only the factors that you mentioned, price and technology, besides the ones that Ambassador Morningstar added. We also, in North America, have an extensive interconnected pipeline network, which was critical to the pace of development. We also have an entire geology database of the whole country. We know exactly where all the shale deposits are because we drilled through them for other reasons. And we have the entrepreneurial expertise and capabilities.
And capital.
And capital. And if you recall, it wasn't the major companies that led this development, and they're the ones that are most involved overseas. So my main focus in the paper was about 5 years. What I'm saying is,
I agree.
in the current,
In the short
environment, I'm not likely to see much change beyond 2020.
Absolutely, I fully agree.
But ultimately, we hope you're right.
Well, before I move to additional questions, perhaps I could follow up on this. So U.S. had this, as many call the unconventional revolution, which was a technological revolution, which was also a revolution about declining costs. Quite significantly dropping the costs for shale gas, shale oil. Now, I just wonder, as the U.S. is coming into a period for some, if anybody can call it the LNG revolution, but being a major LNG player in the global markets, which hasn't been the case so far, I wonder whether the same kind of logic would apply, a major decline in costs for LNG. Would that be something that the US would be driving in the next decade, which could be kind of a potential another game changer in terms of how LNG can compete with pipe gas internationally?
Well, we're already seeing that in the variable costs, but the liquefaction processing units, that is fixed costs. So that generally costs, in the case of the United States, about $3 per million BTU. So that's kind of hard to reduce. It's almost irreducible. The shipping costs, the production costs are more flexible. And I think we will definitely see a sharp fall in shipping costs because there are a lot of LNG tankers that were planned at higher prices, and they're going to be launched, and they're going to have to accept whatever price is offered for the LNG.
Yeah, and if the Henry Hub price stays at $2 or less, how much can you reduce the cost?
Right, most of those costs have already been factored on. So that's part. One other point I should make is that because of shale gas, U.S. gas production is among the lowest in the world, but we can't put shale oil in that category despite the same kind of reductions because the viscosity oil is just so different from gas that it's much more expensive to produce shale oil than shale gas.
All right, yes.
My name's Andrew Walker from Enterprise Energy. My question is, well, I have a couple of questions. First of all is, but you said that there was up to about 200 BCM of capacity to come online. I mean, how much do you realistically think will come online? So that is a huge amount. And the projects need to secure buyers for that energy. So I'd be interested to know what you think, how many of these projects will actually come online, especially since most of the ones that are converting from import terminals into export terminals are now approved, and the rest will be greenfield, including Corpus Christi, which will increase their capex costs. And the other question is about price, whether the US will almost act as a price ceiling for LNG, because a lot of the plants are based on tolling agreements. But if the oversupply continues, then you won't see companies taking that LNG, and they'll be underutilized. So would you expect US production to act as a ceiling for LNG prices around the world?
Okay, I think eventually we'll see 200 BCM, but that could be protracted in its development. I thought Corpus Christi was a brownfield. There is an existing import terminal there. I don't know if they ever started imports, but from what I've read, they expect to add liquefaction and keep the regasification capacity at the same time. I thought they still had some of the other advantages. And that, of course, is coming up for approval in the first half of this year. It is a very large capacity, rather large capacity. But others, I think, will be at least postponed, and some more will be canceled. There was one headline, we've seen a lot of grim headlines about the coming of LNG. One by Wood Mackenzie said 85 projects are dying on the vine. That included projects worldwide. Pointing out that there's been a lot of cancellation of investments in conventional projects. But so far, most of these conventional projects have stayed on the books. So I think we'll see quite a bit more action in terms of postponements.
Yeah, there is, the point is well taken, and I agree with Mike, but I was talking to one company yesterday who has an LNG project, and they were saying that, no, it's still on the books, but we know it's being delayed indefinitely. Like the guy who's running the project is no longer in the country.
They are following the axiom that you have to sell the gas first before you invest the money in the facility. And that's been kind of a maximum of the gas industry, as opposed to the oil industry, where you can make your investment first and then worry about selling it. Most of the gas capacity that's under construction now in the U.S. is already sold. There is some flexibility in those contracts that allow it to become unsold. But there are also some contracts that have tolling provisions where buyers pre-buy capacity in the LNG export terminal for maybe $3 per million BTU, and that's a cost that they have to pay whether they take the LNG or not. So that helps the American sellers. But again, these projects that haven't begun, Corpus Christi has a sizable part of their capacity pre-sold. if they're not able to sell the capacity, it probably won't be built.
Jose Castello, here and users. It's really interesting to try to map the structural position that gas has against a lot of our fuels, coal, others, renewables. I have a picture. Oil. I remember 10 years ago, I had a Cruiser, huge car. I converted it to gas. It was like driving a Clio. Didn't have my pocket. And a lot of people 10 years ago were talking about the possibility of using gas for transportation. That has had withered off. So my question is whether we could see a revival of that and see gas in competition with oil, or whether they will continue to have their own separate markets.
I think there's less impetus to switch from oil to gas now. Of course, the lower cost of oil and gasoline. We are seeing pollution as a primary driver in cities, especially in supplying gas to fleets of buses, taxis, and such, where you have a more easier supply arrangement places where they can refuel. We are seeing an increasing use of LNG and long-range trucking, the US, Europe, China, Russia. And as I said before, I think we're going to see an increasingly in shipping. Europe and North America impose stricter restrictions on shipping emissions within a certain distance of shore. I think it was last year, 2014, and that's kind of motivated some current shipbuilders, in any case, to build in an LNG fuel capability, not just in tankers, but in other marine vessels. But it has slowed because of the convergence of oil and the lowering of oil prices. In particular, I also think that we haven't seen the end of the improvements in efficiency in the gasoline combustion engine when it comes to the point where there is a strong shift away from that. There are more improvements that can be made.
Tony Allen again. I can't resist asking this question of such an elderly panel. One of the most important experiences of my life was living through the 74, 79 oil price or energy price spikes, and the reaction of the United States and the oil sector, the Seven Sisters, to that. France, and immediately, because there was at that stage accessible oil in North Sea, North Slope, within a few years, there we were, and down came the price from a price higher than the highest in 2011. In that it was 55, I think, dollars, and that was a higher price than the recent price spike. And before that, there'd been $2 oil for 70 years, roughly speaking. Strange. So someone was controlling. It wasn't the market; it was, as I say, an oligopoly. But my question is, the U.S. has the capacity, with its military and other, just its economic power, plus its oil technologies and entrepreneurship, globally, to control the energy market. It likes doing that because it's nearly as important as financial hegemony to have energy hegemony. What's going to happen to this time? I thought coming down the price spike of the 70s, we do sensible things and level off, and it would all seem to be controlled by a sensible price. But no, down we came, and then prices fell for both oil and food commodities for the next, up to 2003 when we started to kick up. So we've now got a position where it's in fact the LNG is the equivalent of the North Sea, North Slope. That's hit the the market, the prices have come down, it's still falling. And what is going to happen next? The difference in this situation is that inflation is sort of zero, whereas then it went up to 23%. And I just wonder, with your background in US policy and thinking deeply about US strategy, I presume you can't answer, but am I pointing at anything that counts? The US is determined to have cheap energy, and it can fix it whenever it wants.
42.5 years.
Well, I'd say most importantly, there's recognition that gas resources are different from oil resources. Over the years, it's been easier to control production of oil. We did it with our Texas Railroad Commission before there was an OPEC. OPEC began in 1960 and then really grew teeth in the early 1970s. We were able to more or less control the supply of oil. You're right, the North Sea oil was the biggest factor undermining that ability, even though it remained less than 10% of the market. It was the marginal oil, and as such, actually determined the price as the marginal supply. With gas, there's a recognition that there are gas resources all over the world. There's a cultural mindset in the United States that we need to be competitive, and especially with gas. If we're not producing, someone else is likely to, as opposed to oil. The shale oil revolution was a reaction to the high prices of oil. And it's going to come down. It's been sustained by decreasing prices and financial commitments that were made previously. But there is stickiness in that adjustment. We are seeing lower investment in all types of oil projects around the world. It's just that the timeline that's fed into these cycles that we've seen repetitively that Daniel Yergin likes to point out, that there's 6 down cycle now the global industry is experiencing.
You know, the bottom line, and I know you're not saying this, but you know, there are always all these conspiracy theories about how the United States can control markets, you know, energy markets, and it's just not the case. You know, we can, when prices, you know, or when there's a disruption and the supply goes down, we can help to a limited extent with our, you know, strategic reserves and so on that have, you know, maybe some minor effect. But we just, you know, at the end of the day, even more and more so in the United States, it is the market that is determining what we produce. And, you know, we don't have the ability like, you know, the Saudis or the Russians or other countries may have to ultimately control production. So I think the idea that we somehow can really affect the price is, I just don't think it's there.
Yeah, we have a culture where our most important public goods are national defense, water supply. We're seeing that in Flint, Michigan. And I put number 3 as snow removal. If something is going to get rid of a politician, it's going to be not cleaning the snow out of your city.
Even if they have to go and shovel it themselves.
We have time for only one brief question. Yes, comments.
My name is Esther. I'm a student here at Bud Coote, and I'd like to ask a question related to the Indian market. And if you see feasible the DAP pipeline starting to operate at the end of this decade, but if you see the possibility of Iran trying to boycott it in order to guarantee its LNG exports to India, how do you see this aspect?
Well, I'm saying I see it unfolding slowly. It's, Iran is going to focus on oil exports first. I've always looked at Iran as having 4 priorities for natural gas. Exports are number 4. The first one being providing gas for public consumption by the population. The second one being providing gas supply for reinjection into the oil fields to maintain production pressures, reservoir pressures. And the third one being supplying the growing petrochemical industry, which has been growing strongly and a big revenue source for Iran. I think eventually we will see this connection with India, and it does reach the stage where focus on gas exports as well.
Yeah, and even among the prior, once it even gets to exports, the question, what's the priority going to be? There's a lot of gas to be sold within the region. Like just said, pointing out, they'll emphasize LNG in markets like India. And then, only then may they start thinking in a more limited extent about Europe. So it may happen, but right now, I think we both would argue it's far down the list. David, I think we generally agree, but I think you're a little more optimistic about gas ultimately getting to Europe. It's going to be a while.
Some gas sale, and either an Iranian decision maker, policymaker, I would try to do what the Azeris done quite successfully, is to, of course it's different in the Azeri context, but a limited quantity of gas could go a long way in terms of buying political influence going forward in Europe. And were it to come to a political situation in the next 5-10 years that Europe will understand that sanctions, revival nuclear weapon, or at least accusations to one that's about to revive its nuclear weapons program, and the step back of sanctions, it could come extremely handy from the Iranian perspective to have some limited gas exports going already at that point to Europe, because then it could portray itself as an important country from a supply security perspective. So in my mind, this would warrant at least some limited exports. But I agree with Bud and Baker, but it's not going to be the first priority. It's not going to be major quantities. It's not going to be.
Well, it's been a pleasure to host our 3 distinguished guests from the Atlantic Council. Join me to thank them.
Thank you for all your good questions.
Yes.